Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi, the Mai Pedike, Halacha Aleph and Halacha Beis. We are going to learn today Daf Mem Beis. We left off on Daf Mem Beis, 5 lines from the top of the Amid. By the end of the line, right, Vilama. So we just had a machlokes between Rabbi Yoina and Rabbi Yoisei. Rabbi Yoina holds, and both b'shem Rabbi Zeira, but Rabbi Yoina holds that his teacher Rabbi Zeira said that in our Mishnah, the Seder is accurate, Chala is separated after Meiser Rishon / Trumas Meiser. Rabbi Yossi holds, concerning our case, concerning our Mishnah, that Ein Mishnah Amura ala Seder, Chala Taka comes first. That is where we left off. The Gemara today is going to focus on Shitas Rabbi Yoina, who Taka says that the Seder in the Mishnah is accurate. And Chala Ein Bo Mishum Balta Acher, which means that even though Chala, right, you would argue, should have been brought first because it says Reishis Arisoisechem, Chala is called first. Nevertheless, here the person did not tithe when they should have the Maasros. Let's say that both Chiyuvim are here at the same time. It doesn't matter if you separate Chala later. Okay, it doesn't matter, but still, nevertheless, Chala should be first because it says Reishis Arisoisechem. That will be the opening question of today's Gemara, and we're going to finalize the back and forths, understanding better Shitas Rabbi Yoina. Now we're going to move on today to Halacha Beis. Halacha Beis will be very similar to the first Mishnah in our Pedic. However, as we already spoke out, that this Mishnah is going to be speaking about Tevel. And in other words, what happens if Tevel was made into bread? So here you also have to separate Truma Gedolah. Exactly how are all of the separations done? So there's going to be a similar formula, but we're going to add to it Truma Gedolah. And what we will see is that the owner separates Trumas Meiser in a very roundabout way. First, he states that the 1% that is going to be designated ultimately for Trumas Meiser should stay the way it is, which means Tevel. Then he's going to address the Truma Gedolah, and then he's going to come back to the Trumas Meiser, which is coming from the Meiser Rishon. In other words, he doesn't first speak about Truma Gedolah, and then Meiser Rishon from it, Trumas Meiser. He says that 1%, which eventually will become Trumas Meiser from the Meiser Rishon, now should stay untouched, and then he goes to Truma Gedolah. That will be something that has to be explained. We're not going to learn about this on Daf Mem Beis. We're going to learn about this on Daf Mem Gimel, but just remember and focus on this roundabout type of declaration. We're going to have a topic in the Gemara regarding how many brachas do you have to make. Don't forget, the person over here is going to be separating Truma Gedolah, Meiser Rishon, Trumas Meiser, Chala, Meiser Sheni. Those are 5 separations. And indeed, we're going to have a machlokes. B'shem Rabbi Yoina's son, you have to make 5 different brachas. And we're going to have a braisa, Tani Rab Chia, that you have to make only 1 bracha. And if we'll have time, the conclusion that we'll learn today will be the following. My friends, we keep on speaking about someone buying something from a baker. This person separating the Trumas Meiser. In the first halacha, in the Perek, it makes perfect sense. Because by Demai, which is the case that we're still learning now in halacha Aleph, you never give Meiser Rishon to the Levi. So who will be the one separating the Trumas Meiser? The Yisrael, the person, the Chaver who bought the Demai and is going to rectify it by following the Gezerah, by separating Trumas Meiser. But as we just spoke out, that halacha be'ez, the second topic of today's share is going to be where you have Tevel made into bread, which means you have to separate Truma Gedolah, which means the Meiser Rishon you have to give to a Levi. So let me ask you, exactly who was the one separating Trumas Meiser? The Yisrael or the Levi? Really, it should be the Levi. So that will have to be addressed. So why Bechlal will be speak about, even in Halacha Beis, the buyer, the Yisrael, the Yisrael, doing all of the separations, including Trumas Meiser, when Trumas Meiser should be done by the Levi. That will be the final thing we'll address today. Let's begin. Daf Mem Beis Amud Aleph, again, 5 lines from the top. We are continuing. We're going back to Shitas Rabbi Yoina. Rabbi Yoina explains that there isn't the Isur of separating challah after the Meiser Rishon / Trumas Meiser. But the Seder in the Mishnah is accurate. And exactly as we learned, first you have to deal with the Trumas Meiser / Meiser Rishon. Then you deal with challah. There's no issue with Balta Achar, but still, why would you separate Meiser Rishon before you would separate challah? The Torah calls in Parsha Shalach challah, Reishis, the first, like Truma Gedoyla, which is also called Reishis, Truma Gedoyla comes first, challah should come first. So answers the Gemara, I'll tell you why. Because Meiser Rishon, the chiyuv of Meiser Rishon is triggered when you make the meruach, since its obligation preceded the obligation of challah. Of course, challah is called reishis arisay seichem, because when you make a dough, the first thing you have to do is separate challah. It's the first from your dough. We understand that. But the chiyuv of Maisres was when you made a gemar malacha out there in the field, in the goyden, by doing the meruach, or by the iyas pnei habayis, which also happens prior to making the dough. So since its obligation precedes the obligation of challah, you have to do it before challah. That won't be a proper answer, because in the Mishnah we learned to say that it's not Meiser Rishon, Trumas Meiser, Meiser Sheni, and challah. The Mishnah sandwiches challah between Meiser Rishon and Meiser Sheni. And if the reason why Meiser Rishon comes first is because Kedama Lagoiden, Frek the Gemara, Vahare, Sheni also, Kedama Lagoiden, so Eibazoi, it should be Meiser Rishon, Trumas Meiser, Meiser Sheni, and then challah. That's not the Seder of the Mishnah. Amar Rav Matanya, or Amar Rav Masniya, answers the Gemara, Bedin Hoya, Shetikdem challah lakoil. Let's go back. You're right. Challah is called the Reishis Arisay Seichem. And Velama Kodma Rishon, because number one, Shekadama Lagoiden, what we gave before is part of the answer. It's not all of the answer. Yes, its obligation came prior to the obligation of challah, but there's another thing that Meiser Rishon has, and that is the Kosuv Boy Reishis. What is Pshat the Kosuv Boy Reishis? Says the Pnei Moshe 3 lines under, 3 lines in the widest lines. Don't forget that from the Meiser Rishon, you remove Trumas Meiser. Trumas Meiser is Truma. Truma is called Reishis. So really, there are 2 things that you have in the Meiser Rishon. Number 1, Shekadama Lagoiden. Number 2, because since in the Meiser Rishon you have Trumas Meiser, Truma is called Reishis. So now you have 2 reasons over the Challah. Challah has 1 reason, Reishis Arisay Seichem. The Meiser Rishon to Trumas Meiser has 2 reasons, Kedama Lagoiden, and because of Bar Reishis, which part of the Meiser Rishon is Reishis? Not the Meiser Rishon part. We're not saying because it's Rishon. No, Reishis means the Trumas Meiser, that which goes to the Kohen. However, when it comes to the Sheni, you don't have both. True, the obligation was triggered earlier. The obligation preceded the obligation of Challah, but that's only one. It's one-on-one. However, there's no Reishis connected to Meiser Sheni. Ain't cause of Reishis. So therefore, Challah comes first. And all of this, my friends, again, is only L'shitas Rabbi Yoina, because L'shitas Rabbi Yoina say, indeed, Challah will come first. All right. And now let's move on. Now, we already mentioned Halacha Beis in the previous sugya. This is like a practical Mishnah of how does one separate the Trumas and the Meises. And I know that I'm mentioning that we're speaking about a bread that was made out of tevel. We will see that the Mishnah, for some reason, doesn't go through all of the steps, but whatever the Mishnah omits will be included in the Braisa. Okay? So here you have a person that bought a loaf of bread. For whatever reason, the seller of the bread made the bread out of bonafide tevel. So what do you have to deal with? Truma Gedoyla, everything now. Ma'aser properly to give it to the Levi. From it, Trumas Ma'aser. And again, I know I mentioned that normally we follow the Shita, which is the majority opinion that the Levi Dafke is the one that separates Trumas Ma'aser from Ma'aser. The owner doesn't own it to make that separation. For some reason, the Mishnah is going to be attributing that separation to the person who owns the bread. We'll deal with that in the Gemara. So, Truma Gedoyla, Ma'aser, Trumas Ma'aser. We're following with Rabbi Yoina in this Mishnah as well. Chala, and then we have Ma'aser Sheni. Very good. So, Zogt, the Mishnah, Truma, Utrumas Ma'aser Ki Echad. And let's separate out the Ma'aser, which is really chulin, even though you have to gift it to the Levi. Let's separate the Ma'aser Sheni, which has some level of kedusha, but it stays in the property, it stays with the balabas, even though he has to take it to Yerushalmi or redeem it, versus Truma. The Truma and the Trumas Ma'aser has to be given to the Kohen. Now let's think together. What do you have over here? How much percent will be the Truma and the Trumas Ma'aser? So even though Midoiraisa, Truma does not have a share, nevertheless, as we keep on quoting, the ideal, let's say the average is to give 1 of 50, which is 2%. So 2% of what you have is going to be going als Truma. How much is Trumas Ma'aser? It's a total of 1%, right? But the 1% is, you don't go straight to the 1%. You separate 10%. And from the 10%, you separate from it 10%. 10% from 10%. What you can approximately say that a total, what will go to the coin is 3% before the challah. I know we're not talking about the challah. Truma Gedoyla 2, Trumas Ma'aser 1. Another nuance. It's not really 3%. Why is that? Because the Ma'aser Rishon is 10% of what remains after you separated the Truma Gedoyla. To make that clear. So if you would have numbers, you can count it, 100 apples. So what will go to the Kohen als Truma Gedoyla is 2 apples, 2%. Truma Gedoyla is 2 apples. Even though it doesn't have to be, you can give less, you can give more. What will end up going to the Kohen als Trumas Ma'aser is going to be less than 1 apple. It's going to be 0.98. Because you have 98 apples. 98 apples means Ma'aser Rishon is 9.8. 10% of that is 0.98. The Mishnah will round it off into 3%, not because the 3% is not precise, because you can add to the Truma. People that were generous would give more than 2%. So the Mishnah will speak about a separation of a total of 3%. Forget about Challah for a moment. 3% division Truma Gedoyla and Trumas Ma'aser. But just to know exactly what that would mean, Vlad, it would mean 2.02 Truma Gedoyla, in order for the 90.98 of the Trumas Ma'aser to be 3%. Okay. So Haroitza lahafresh Truma Gedoyla Trumas Ma'aser ki echad, says the Mishnah. Noitel echad mishloishim ushloisha ushlish. You mark off from every 33.3 1 part. In other words, from 100, how much do you mark off? 3%. What's 3% of 100? 3. But in other words, that's the cheshbon. We're separating everything into thirds, which is fine. What's a third of 100, Vlad? 33.3. That's what the Mishnah is saying. In other words, you're separating 3%, 3/100 of the pie. Now, what would you say without reading the Mishnah? What is the first thing that you need to do? You have to separate Truma Gedoyla. For some reason, we're going to learn this in the next year. You dafke don't begin speak about Truma Gedoyla. You make a mark, like we learned in the first chapter. This noitel doesn't mean you physically take it, it means you mark it. You make a mark on the loaf of bread. And you want to speak about Truma Gedoyla. But before you speak about Truma Gedoyla, you declare that from the 3/100 of the pile, from the 3%, echad mimeya mimashi yeshkan, the first of what's here. From which side, guys? Because you have a loaf of bread, you have 97% on the left, let's say, and you have the 3 on the right. Bitzad harei zeh bitzad zeh, that which is on the right side, that which is within the mark, the first 1%, I'm leaving the way it is. Chulin doesn't really mean chulin. The whole thing is tevel. Chulin means one is going to be for the Trumas Meiser. I don't want to speak about it right now. So I'm leaving one. Chulin means the way it is. And now the other 2% will be the Truma Gedolah. Turning to Daf Mem Beis Amud Beis, Usha'ar Truma ala Koel, which is quite amazing. Okay. And again, I want to make it clear that it's not exactly 1%. What you're really saying is Daf Mem Beis and now Amud Beis. What you're really saying is that 0.98, I'm leaving the way it is. Harei zeh bitzad zeh, the 0.98, which is on the side of the mark, which will be designated for the kohen. Right now, let's leave it chulin the way it is. So now what do I really have left? I have the 2.02, approximately 2%. Usha'ar truma ala koel. In other words, that 2% or really 2.02 is truma gedolah. Now you have within the mark the one that you first spoke about, that you're leaving the way it is. Now that one, umeya chulin sheishkan, the one or the 0.98 that I made sure it should stay the way it is, but which is in that marked off area. And now we're going to go back to do exactly what we did in the first halach, and that is, yeah, Vlad, you can't just say this is Trumas Meiser. It doesn't work that way. You have to separate Meiser Rishon, and then from the Meiser Rishon, separate the Trumas Meiser. In the marked off area now, you only have 1% available. So what you have to say is that this 1% with 9 other equivalent percents, which means 1 within the marked, the other 9, which is right outside the marked area, together, that's Meiser Rishon. And from the Meiser Rishon, I'm designating the one as Trumas Meiser. That's what he says. Harei zeh bitzad zeh purakama is Meiser. Meiser means Meiser Rishon, guys, not Trumas Meiser. You cannot first give Trumas Meiser. Usha'ar Meiser samachloi. Meiser Rishon is not 1%. Meiser Rishon is not 0.98%. You know how much Meiser Rishon will be? It's going to be from the total 9.8%, right? Be'erech 10%, right? Or 10% from that which remained after you separated the Truma Gedolah. So you're saying this Usha'ar Meiser Samachloi, whatever is needed, which is another 9 times its amount, that will become Meiser Rishon. So this statement of the 1 plus the 9 is Meiser. And now the one that's within the marked off area, also Trumas Meiser Olav. Now I'm separating Trumas Meiser, but I already marked off the Trumas Meiser. So it comes out that everything that's within the marked off area is the 3% now goes to the coin. Now, the next words in the Mishnah are very difficult, and actually some don't even have these words. Usha'ar chala. I'll tell you why. What's the obvious problem with usha'ar chala, guys? How much is chala? We already mentioned that from a baker gives a little bit more than 2%. If the balabas gives a little bit more than 4%. The Mishnah says, now, challah goes to a kohen. Let's go with the baker. The Mishnah spoke about separating 3%. Really, if you're going to also speak about challah, how much more should you leave in the marked off area for the kohen? 5% and a bit. Because the baker gives 1/48th. So it's not 2%. It's a bit more than 2%. We said that before. The Mishnah didn't say that you leave a 5% plus. The Mishnah spoke about 3%. So if the Mishnah did not speak about challah in the beginning, then why is it speaking about challah now? Some people are not goyres it. If you have the girsa that we have, that what usha'ar challah, I just want to make it clear. Usha'ar challah means that you're going to be separating. The marked off area won't be 3, it will be 5. In other words, either the girsa is 3 and the Mishnah is not speaking about challah, or the Mishnah is speaking about challah and really you have to mark off 5 plus. Gewaldig. Okay, and that, which will just align our Mishnah with the first Mishnah, with the exception, with the big difference that our Mishnah is speaking about Tevel. So now you dealt with Truma Gedola, Ma'aser Rishon, Chala. We just learned right now today. Noch, let's go that if the Seder is Meduyak, Rabbi Yoina says exactly why Chala comes. Now, number one, there's no Bal Ta'achar by Chala. Number two, that which goes to the Kohen, since it's called Reishis, and the Chiyuv was triggered before, it comes first. There are two reasons for it to come first. Chala goes to the Kohen, comes second. I know Ma'aser Rishon was separated here because the only way you can get to Trumas Ma'aser is by separating Ma'aser Rishon. Ma'aser Sheni was triggered by the Goyden, by the Meruach, or by the Re'iyas Pnei Habayis, but nothing in it is called Reishis. So Ma'aser Sheni comes the last. And indeed, from what is on the other side of the marked off area, 10% of it is going to be called Ma'aser Sheni, or guys, in the third year and in the sixth year, Ma'aser Ani. And what you need to do is just to say, Ma'aser Sheni is going to be either in the northern part of this pile, or of this basket, or of this box, or you say, B'd'raimai. You don't have to mark anything, but it's not enough for you to say that the Ma'aser Sheni in here is going to be redeemed on money. You have to first make a designation. When you make a designation, which is called Kriya Shem, you have to designate the location of it, not exact with a mark, but you say it's B'tzafain or it's B'darain. And now that it's designated, final step will be Umechul ala ma'is. Ma'aser Sheni proper doesn't need to be taken to Yerushalmi. You have the option of redeeming it on money. And unlike we learned in the Halacha Aleph of this Perek, that by the Ma you don't add a Choimish, the Mishnah doesn't have to speak about it now because you have to know on your own that when you're Mechalel, Hevel, proper Ma'aser Sheni, if you, the Balabas, are being Mechalelit, which is what's happening, you have to add a fifth. Okay. You know what the Mishnah didn't explicitly say? That you remove the Ma'aser Rishon. The Mishnah only spoke about your designating of the Ma'aser Rishon by taking that 1 point that was left chulin with the 9 points equivalent to it on the other side of the mark as Ma'aser Rishon, and now the one within the marked area becomes Trumas Ma'aser. What really also needs to happen is you need to separate Begashmiyas. The Ma'aser Rishon, and I'm going to come back to that when we come to the end of today's daf, that if the owner of the bread, the guy that bought it, is a Kohen or a Levi, then they don't have to separate it. A Kohen has to separate Trumas Ma'aser, even though he's a Kohen. A Levi has to separate Trumas Ma'aser, but they get to keep the Ma'aser Rishon. A Kohen gets to keep the Ma'aser Rishon. I know we always say that Ma'aser Rishon goes to a Levi. You know what a Kohen is? A Kohen is also a Levi. Where do you think a Kohen comes from? Comes from a Levi. Okay. Says the Gemara. So now we're going to have the same rule elaborated a bit more. Funny, we learned in the Brayz that Haroitz lahafresh truma utrumas ma'aser v'chala ka'achas. See, the Mishnah, like we pointed out, didn't begin right to speak about chala. It says Haroitz lahafresh truma utrumas ma'aser. What about chala, right? And we had v'hashar chala. So the Mishnah is either Rabbi just implied, or maybe the Girsa is wrong. The Braysa speaks the whole thing out. So clearly, you're not going to mark off a 3% won't be enough. Like I mentioned, you have to mark off 5% and a bit. You know what? If the bread was not made by a baker, how much will it be then? It will be 7% and a bit. Okay. So noitel means you make a mark. You don't physically take it off, but you have to make a mark in your bread. How much should be within the mark? That in there should be enough kedei truma, which is 2%, utrumas ma'aser, which is going to be 1%, v'chala, either 2 and a bit or 4 and a bit, ka'achas, they will be all together. And v'kamahein, and how much is that? So we're speaking about a nachtoi making the bread. A nachtoi making the bread means 5%. I know it's 5% in a bit, but we're rounding it off. Echad me'asrim. Echad me'asrim means 5%. And like I said, it doesn't matter. Really, it's a bit more than 5%. Okay, klor. or a bit more than 7% if a balabas is the one that used tevel grain to bake a bread. And like we had in the Mishnah, even though the Seder is first Truma Gedoyla, for some reason that we'll learn in Daf Mem Gimel, you have to say that the other parts that won't be for Truma Gedoyla, leave it the way it is. 1 of 100, which is within this marked off area. I'm leaving it within the marked area, but I'm leaving it. Chulin means not chulin, banafite chulin. Chulin means tevel, means I'm leaving it the way it is. And why? What is it? It's tevel. And the 1/48 next to it, which is the amount that you will be designating soon as challah, I'm also leaving it chulin, which means tevel. So what do I have now left in this marked off area? Be'erech only the 2%. And that is what you're designating first. V'hashar, the other 2% is truma ala koil. Now, umeh hachulin sheyesh by continues the brayso from the chulin that I said should stay chulin in the marked off area. What comes next? What comes next is trumas meiser. But the challenge with Trumas Meiser is you have to first separate Meiser Rishon to separate from it Trumas Meiser. You did not mark off enough for Meiser Rishon. Bedafke. So what you're doing is that you're saying that Zeh Sha'osisi Chulin, that Be'erech 1% that I said should remain Chulin, which means remaining Tevel. Now this becomes Meiser Rishon. Whoa, this is only 1%. Meiser Rishon is 10%. I know. It is Meiser Rishon, Usha'ar Meiser Samachloi, and all of the extra needed for Meiser, which is another 9%, is adjacent to this one that I'm designating near the marked off area. So I'm saying if there's a mark on the bread, let's just say that the part of the right is what's Truma Gedoyla, Trumas Meiser, and Challah. Everything to the left, the bulk, is Chulin. So I'm saying that the 1% that ultimately will become Trumas Meiser, that first has to be designated as Meiser Rishon, is the one mamish by the mark. So that and 9 other parts like it is Meiser Rishon. So now I actually designated 10%. And now I'm saying, the 1 point within the marked off area that was first declared as Meiser Rishon, now it becomes Trumas Meiser Olav. So now you already spoke about the Erech, 3% within the marked off area. Gavaldik, that in this Braisa, we spoke about marking off 5%, which is taka what you need if you're designating Challah. And let's go with the brackets. Hashar, like we had in the Mishnah, whatever remains in the marked off area, which is 2%, and really, guys, it's 2% plus, because Anachtim separates 1/48, not 1 from 50, so it's not 2%, it's 2% and a bit, that will remain Challah. Again, mamish like we had in the Mishnah. So now all you have to deal with is Ma'aser Sheni. Ma'aser Sheni doesn't have to be marked off. But you can't say that there is Ma'aser Sheni in here. That's not enough. You have to designate a part of the basket, a part of your pile, and the part would mean a direction. Now, that which is here in the north or that which is in the south is Ma'aser Sheni. So now it's designated. You don't even have to take it out because we are going to employ the option of redeeming. Umachulol al hamoish, mamish like the Mishnah. Okay, so now, when you separate Trumas from Isis, I know that we are living currently in Golus, LA, you make a bracha. Guys, lahafresh. So the question is, you just separated 5 Meiseres. Truma Gedoyla, Meiser Rishon, Trumas Meiser, Challah, Meiser Sheni. If you would have done it at different times, you would have made a separate bracha for each one. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvos v'tzivanu lahafresh Truma Gedoyla, lahafresh Meiser Rishon, lahafresh Trumas Meiser, lahafresh Challah. Right? That's what we'd say today. Lahafresh Meiser Sheni. We're not even talking about the bracha that you make for the pidyon, just for the hafrasha. So says the Gemara, Rab Shmuel bar Nachman, in the name of Rabbi Yonason, says that even though you're doing it all together, you're marking it off together, you have it in one loaf of bread, doesn't matter. You make 5 separate brachas. However, Tani Rab Chia argues, that Rab Chia, no, that koilulon bracha achas. You make it all in one bracha. Now, what is the nusach of the one bracha? Have a look inside the Rashirilio on the left column, 6 lines before the bottom of the Amid, 6, 7 lines before the bottom of the Amid, right? Rashirilio divrei hamaschel koilulon bracha achas. I'm going into the next line under it. So he says the kiv in the kol hasoy mitztarfen, since everything was done together, and it's not only was it done together, it's in a loaf of bread. It's in one thing. So koilam ka'achas v'yoymar asher. That's the Rashi Tevis. Kedishanu b'mitzvaysa v'tzivanu, and you say lahafresh truma u'maiser u'trumas maiser v'chala u'maiser sheni. So says the Rashi Ilio. In other words, you make one shemu malchus, one asher kedishanu b'mitzvaysa v'tzivanu, but then you specify in the bracha all of the 5. However, let's go weiter in the Rash. Because of Rambam Zal, the Perek Al Model Chasmaiser, and we Mamish just learned this for those of us who are learning 3 chapters of Rambam a day. If you had no hefsek, if you did exactly, you made the declarations that the Mishnah said, and you had no other conversation other than it, then you don't say lahafrish truma umaiser v'trumas maiser v'chalo maiser sheni, but you know what you say? Lahafresh trumas umaisers. Lahafresh trumas umaisers. So it's even a shorter, more abbreviated bracha. That is a machlekes. And now, like we mentioned, by demai, guys, that's the rule. Since the person, the chaver who bought the demai, is not going to be giving demai sedishon to a Levi, right? The Pnei Moshe and Daf Aleph, because Havmoitzim Echavere Olavaraya, but on the other hand, he's chayiv to give to a kohen trumas maiser. Obviously, the first halach of this pedic, it is the buyer, the chaver, whether he's a kohen Levi or Yisrael, he'll be the one separating trumas maiser. Problem is that our Mishnah is speaking about tevel. In our Mishnah, not only do you have to make a declaration about maiser edition, you actually have to give the maiser edition to a Levi. So the problem is, that's the premise, even though it's really subject to a machlekes tanoim. But the Das Rabbim is that the Yisrael who's making the hafrashas of Trumos Umaisres is not the one who has the balabatishkeit to do the mitzvah lahafresh Trumas Maiser. Yet our Mishnah is speaking about the guy that bought it, he's doing it all. How does that work? It must be, says the Gemara, at Kedoin, that our Mishnah is speaking about a Kohen or a Levi. This is great. Think about it. If you're a Kohen keeps Maiser Rishon. I want you to know, right, that as we learned many times in Talmud Bavli, that when Ezra made an effort to get many Yidden to come to the Holy Land, while he was finalizing the building of the second Beis Hamikdash, he only managed to gather with him a very small number of people. That was very disappointing. The bulk of the Yidden remained in Bavel/Persia. What was even worse is that there were no Levium. And because of that, Ezra made a takana to penalize the Levium, that Maiser Rishon Bechlal should not go to the Levium. Maiser Rishon always could have gone to the Kahanim, just it didn't need to go to the Kahanim. Truma has to go to a Kohen. Trumas Maiser has to go to a Kohen. Chala has to go to a Kohen. Maiser Rishon goes to anyone who comes from Levi. There was a time that we only gave it to a Kohen. Why am I saying that? That if you are a Kohen and you are making bread, you have to be mafresh Truma, even though you're a Kohen. You can keep it, but you have to be mafresh. You have to be mafresh the Truma Maiser. You are mafresh the Maiser Rishon, but you keep it. So our Mishnah makes sense only if we're speaking about a Kohen or a Levi. In other words, they are mafresh the Maiser Rishon. You have to give it to a Kohen or a Levi, but the Maiser Rishon, he keeps. You separated it from the rest. You have to separate Maiser Rishon in order to separate Trumas Maiser. By the way, it's different. In other words, the remaining is Chulin. if it becomes tameh, you can eat it. You could eat it. If truma becomes tameh, you can't eat it. It's kaddish chulin. You have to separate it. But so our Mishnah makes sense only if we're speaking about a kohen or a Levi turning to Daf Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. However, when it comes to a Yisrael, in Yemar Trumas Meiser, Nimsa Mafresh Al Davar She'ena Shaloi, if he would be the one separating the Trumas Meiser, then it wouldn't be okay. Because a Yisrael lacks, let's say, the authority to take Trumas Meiser. This is not something the Gemara needed to address in the previous Mishnah, because in the previous Mishnah we're speaking about the Mai, and in the Mai, since you don't give the Meiser edition to a Levi, he does have the authority and the responsibility. But that's a chiddush that we have over here. And like I mentioned, really, if you look in Talmud Bavli, Gittin Daf Lamed Amud Beis, you'll see over there that this premise that the Gemara is not debating about is really subject to a machlokes tanoim. There is a Tana Abba Eliezer ben Gamlo who holds that a Yisrael has the right to separate the Trumas Meiser from the Meiser Rishon. He has to give then the 9% to the Levi, and the 1% he gets to choose to what coin to give it to. But that's only Das Yachid. Our Gemara is not giving that any daylight, and doesn't matter. The Mishnah just wants to point out that our Mishnah is speaking about a Kohen or a Levi, and a Yisrael indeed is unable to do so. We're gonna leave the Gemara over here. What we have to explain is this roundabout way. Like if you're doing Truma Gedolah first, which is what you're doing, then do Truma Gedolah, and then speak about Meiser Rishon, then speak about Challah. But that's not what you're doing. You're saying that from what I marked off, one should not be touched yet. And now you speak about Truma Gedolah. Why do you have to do it that way? To be continued.